Good night from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Yesterday, on August the 4th, 2020, was broadcast a controversial interview by an Australian journalist, Jonathan Swan, of the US President Donald Trump, where Trump dug up his own statistics to contradict the obvious facts, namely that his administration so far has been unsuccessful in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, given the fact that the United States has, according to the worldometers.info website, almost exactly 160,000 deaths already, human deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic, with nearly 4.9 million infections. The world as a whole now has already over 18.5 million deaths from, or human deaths from the COVID-19, or over 18.5 million infections, from the COVID-19 pandemic, and just over 700,000 deaths. Yes, there have been over 11.7 million recoveries, which by itself is a positive piece of statistic. So what did President when Swan commented, for the past 5 months, the interview was given by Trump, I think, in the last week of July 2020. For the past 5 months, it's been, the message that President Trump has been saying, the virus is totally under control. Trump, look, nobody knew what this thing was all about. This has never happened before, 1917, but it was totally different. It was a flu in that case, the Spanish flu, and that pandemic ended up killing, even by conservative estimates, at least 20 million people worldwide. More likely between 20 and 50 million. The most radical estimates put the death toll from that pandemic a century ago at between 50 and 100 million. The world's population back then was under 2 billion people. Now it's 7.8 billion. And by the way, if you watch the fake news on television, they don't even talk about it, but there are 188 other countries right now that are suffering, some proportionately far greater than we are. Swan, very few worse. Trump stuck to his guns. You look at Moscow, look at what's going on with Moscow. Well, for Trump's information, we have to put things in perspective. According to the latest statistics compiled by worldometers.info, in Russia, there have been over 860,000 or 861,000 infections, human infections, versus over 4,877,000 human infections in the United States. According to this statistical website, over 159,000 humans have died in the United States of the COVID-19 pandemic versus over 14,000 in Russia. And what about the populations? In the United States, according to the worldometers.info website, there are slightly over 331 million people. In Russia, there are almost 146 million people. So even on a per capita basis, according to the official statistics, the COVID-19 pandemic has so far been far more devastating in the United States than in the United States. Next, President Trump said, look at Brazil. Well, Brazil's population is over 212 million people. So not that much below the US population. In Brazil, there have been over 2,759,000 human infections and over 95,000 human deaths. Next, Trump said This was sent to us by China. Well, it's true that the pandemic first broke out in Wuhan, China, and we're never going to forget it. And we were beating China at every single point. Well, certainly not in terms of the economic growth rate. For many years, China had far outdistanced the United States. Yes, it's true that in 2019 the Chinese economy started to slow down clearly, but even then I'm unsure whether the economic growth was as low as in the US. Yes, the Chinese gross domestic product has fallen, but so has that of virtually every other country on the face of the earth. Trump continued, then all of a sudden the game changed and I had to close it down. I closed down the greatest economy ever in history. That's certainly not true in terms of the economy living within its means. The US belongs to the growing number of countries whose gross domestic or national debt is already bigger than its and their gross domestic product, the estimated value of goods and services produced in those countries per year. And also in terms of the economic growth rate, yes, it is true that the US enjoyed a steady economic growth rate of between 2 and 3% per year in terms of the GDP growth during the first 3 years of Trump's presidency, just before the pandemic caused a massive lockdown. And Trump even boasted about that economic growth in late January 2020 in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Central Europe. What he didn't mention, of course, was the growing national debt and the fact that even in the fiscal year of 2018 to 19, the budget deficit, federal budget deficit, was still over 900 billion US dollars, and now it's expected to be probably something like 5 trillion, or at least much more than just $1 trillion. The greatest economy in the history of the world would also have had a clearly smaller income gap between the rich and the poor than the United States has had, even at the height of its prosperity and even at the height of its rather meager welfare state. But this is typical Trumpian exaggeration, which is very sad. Then he claimed that even one person is too much, even one person who dies of the COVID pandemic. We would have lost millions of people. So once again, he took credit for saving millions of lives. The fact is that he had to be prodded. He had been warned at least a few or some, perhaps even several times, of the seriousness of the pandemic, yet it took him until the last week of January 2020 to start taking effective action by banning non-essential travel to the United States from China. And that was then followed by a ban on most non-essential travel to the United States from Europe. He called in February 2020 in a re-election campaign rally or event the COVID-19 pandemic a hoax. As recently as in June 2020, in two re-election campaign events, he called COVID-19 pandemic Kung Flu, which was, of course, a pun or word game on Kung Fu. He claimed on one occasion in June 2020 that supposedly the COVID-19 pandemic was dying down. And then more recently has claimed that it's just going to disappear someday. Well, it will end someday, but probably in spite of his efforts, not because of them. And he claimed that the people who really understand this pandemic, they said it's incredible the job that we've done. And then Swan asked, who says that? Trump, again, the banning China from coming in. Swan noted, but it was already in here. It was already here. By the time you banned China, it came through Europe, meaning the pandemic. And then Trump repeated, nobody knew the extent, nobody knew how contagious it was. Swan replied, but the question is, Mr. President, by June, we knew things were bad. And you know, the last time I was with you was the day before your Tulsa rally. And you were saying, big, huge crowd, it was indoors. These people, they listened to you. And then Trump tried to correct Swan, saying, we had a 19,000 seat stadium. First of all, we had 12,000 people, not 6,000, which you reported and other people reported, but you couldn't even get in. Swan asked, why would you have wanted that? Trump replied, you had 120 Black Lives Matter people there. Swan probed, why would you have wanted a huge crowd? And then Trump sort of evaded the question, excuse me, wait, and Tulsa, well, because that area was a very good area at the time. Swan politely replied, I think you misunderstand me. I'm not criticizing your ability to draw a crowd. I've covered you for 5 years. You draw massive crowds. I'm asking about the public health. And then Trump, ignoring the question, said, or partly ignoring the question, replied, I canceled another one. We were going to have a great crowd in New Hampshire, and I canceled it for the same reason. And Swan noted, I've covered you for a long time. I've gone to your rallies. I've talked to your people. They love you. They listen to you. They don't listen to me or the media or Fauci, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been leading the White House's COVID-19 response team now for several months. They think we're fake news. And so when they hear you say everything's under control, don't worry about wearing masks. These are people, many of them are older people, Mr. President. It's giving them a false sense of security. Trump asked, well, what's your definition of control? Under the circumstances right now, I think it's under control. And Swan asked, how? 1,000 are dying a day. Trump replied, they are dying, that's true. And it is what it is. So he was essentially implying that he can't prevent their deaths. But that doesn't mean we aren't doing everything we can. It's under control as much as you can control it. This is a horrible plague that beset us. Swan probed, you really think this is as much as we can control it, 1,000 deaths a day? Trump replied, I'd like to know if somebody, first of all, we've done a great job, who were not hearing all they could. Then he said, we had some incredible governors. And then the journalist covering the interview, writing for the New Zealand Herald, which is one of New Zealand's largest daily newspapers. To be fair, Trump, this sort of attempt, or to be fair to Trump, probably it should be, this sort of attempt to shift the blame for a bungled crisis to someone else is pretty standard stuff from a politician. And we have to say, human beings, because ever since the Garden of Eden, Adam basically was blaming Eve for giving him the fruit from the forbidden tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as if he could not have refused. Ever since then, people have been blaming other people for their wrong choices, for their sinful and unethical action. Then Trump once again started to play on his favorite excuse that supposedly the United States is testing so many people that because of that, it has the largest number of human infections and human deaths. You know, there are those that say you can test too much, or maybe too many, if you're talking of people. You do know that. Swan replied by asking, who says that? Trump replied, oh, just read oh, just read the manuals or read the manuals, read the books. And then Swan asked him to specify manuals. What? And Trump just vaguely replied, read the books, read the books. What books? And Trump just said, what testing does. Swan wanted to know. No, I'm sorry, who says? Then Trump tried to answer. Let me explain. What testing does, it shows cases. It shows where they may be cases. Other countries test, when they test when somebody is sick. Actually, that's not fully true, and he knows it. He must know it. While there are countries which, for example, because of the shortage of medical personnel, especially in Africa, also partly here in Asia, partly in Latin America, maybe partly even in the poor Oceanian countries outside Australia and New Zealand, except that so far they have been largely spared from this pandemic, partly because of their geographic isolation. At least most European countries are probably testing quite many people, or many are at least. Canada is testing many. He said nothing about the fact that Canada, while having, yes, only something like 1/9 of the US population, so Canada's population is now over 37 million, so far has had, let's look at the numbers. So far has had over 117,000 human infections and over 8,900 human deaths. So only a fraction in both cases of the deaths that, of the infections and deaths that the United States has had. So Canada, for example, has been a lot more effective in its response to the pandemic. And I'm not saying they are right or wrong. Done it, they've done it. We've got absolutely no credit for it, but we've come up with so many tests. The only thing we have now is some people have to wait longer than we'd like them to. Swan noted it's a big problem. Trump countered. Excuse me, one thing I would say about testing, because we test so much, we show cases. So we show many, many cases. We should, or show tremendous numbers of cases. I know you're smiling when I say that, but Swan interrupted. No, but come on. I've heard you say this, but. And Trump still continued. Other countries don't test like we do, so they don't show cases. Swan noted. Just a couple of points on that. I wasn't going to continue on the testing, but you said it. So we're testing so much because it spread so far in America, and Trump interrupted. We're testing so much because we had the ability to test because we came up with Jonathan. We didn't even have a test. When I took over, we didn't even have a test. Assuming he talked about his inauguration back in January 2017, and then Swan predictably interjected, why would you have a test? The virus didn't exist. How would you have a test? And then Trump claimed, I was going to say there was no test for this we didn't have a test because there was no test. And then Swan noted, of course. And then Trump continued. And in very short order, we got one test, we got another test. Swan interjected, it was broken, the first one. And then Trump went on. Many of these tests, those tests are now obsolete because, it's called science and all of a sudden something's better. But because we tested so many people, 55 to 60 million people, very soon we get cases. You test, some kid has even just a little runny nose, it's a case. And then you report many cases. Once again, I'm afraid that he was exaggerating and distorting the truth. So we look like we have more cases than massive countries like China, which, by the way, doesn't report, as you know. Swan noted, I don't put any stock in China's figures. Of course, we have to remember that we must take China's figures with a grain of salt. China is a communist, totalitarian dictatorship, and obviously the government there is doing anything it can to look good in the ordinary people's eyes. Just like in, for example, Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, and Cuba, which are all also communist dictatorships. Trump said, the point is because we are so much better at testing than any other country in the world, we show more cases. Swan noted, the figure I look at is death, and death is going up now. It's 1,000 a day. Trump still argued back. If you look at death, take a look at some of these charts. And then the president reached over and picked up a few sheets of paper. Here's one. Well, right here, United States is lowest in numerous categories. We are lower than the world. Swan, not wanting to believe Trump, asked, lower than the world? Trump specified lower than Europe. Well, Europe is not the entire world. Neither is the United States. And then Swan asked Trump to specify, in what? In what? Oh, you are doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad, much worse than Germany, South Korea, etc. So let's look at the numbers. Over 159,000 deaths in the United States. By contrast, in Germany, over 9,000 deaths. Germany, by the way, has over 82 million people, or over 83 million people. So about 1/4 of the US population. And then South Korea has, let's see, 301 deaths. And how many people does South Korea have? It has over 51 million people. So even on a per capita basis, for example, Germany and South Korea are in a much better situation in terms of the absolute number of deaths, or numbers of deaths, than the United States is. Then Trump claimed, you can't do that. And Swan asked, why can't I do that? Trump said, you have to go by, look, here's the United States, you have to go by the cases of death. And Swan countered, why not as a proportion of population? And Trump interjected or answered, what it says is when you have somebody, when there's a case, the people that live from those cases. And then Swan replied, sure. It's surely a relevant statistic to say if the US has X population and X percentage of death of that population opposed to some. Then Trump still repeated, no, because you have to go by the cases. And Swan noted, in South Korea, for example, 51 million population, 300 deaths. It's crazy compared to other countries. And then Trump countered, you don't know that. And Swan predictably retorted, I do. You think they are faking their statistics, South Korea? And then Trump, I won't get into that because I have a very good relationship with the country. So partly it seems to depend on whether the United States has a good or a bad relationship with the country, whether he's going to believe those figures. That's quite opportunistical, in my opinion. But you don't know that they have spikes. Swan, Germany low 9,000s. Then Trump, here's one right here. United States, the number of cases, we have a look. We're last, meaning we're first. And Trump was brandishing another chart at this point. Swan, incredulous, asked, last? I don't know what we're first in. And Trump continued, take a look, it's cases. And we have cases because of the testing. But Swan kept countering him. I mean, 1,000 Americans are dying a day, but I understand on cases it's different. And then Trump continued, no, but you're not reporting it correctly, Jonathan. And Swan replied, I think I am. That mercifully was the end of the discussion about coronavirus. Other noteworthy moments from the interview included Trump's assertion that he reads a lot and comprehends extraordinarily well. Now, that is what you would expect someone like him to say. Someone with a super high ego, someone who is very self-centered, arrogant, and proud. and who doesn't like being contradicted even with facts. His assertion that mail-in voting, which has been in existence in the United States since the Civil War in the early 1860s, is a new phenomenon. His belief that he's done more for African Americans than the late President Lyndon Johnson, who persuaded the US Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act, and his answer that he doesn't know how history will remember the recently deceased civil rights icon John Lewis, because Trump never met him, and I quote, "He didn't come to my inauguration." The greatest highlight of all, however, may have been Swan's ability to hold it together. Let's look at a few other numbers here. India has 1.4 billion people, almost, 1.38 billion. And how many COVID cases does India have? So far, just over 1.9 million. So India, which has about 4 times as many people, or actually even over 4 times as many people as the United States, still has fewer cases. And I don't honestly believe that in India only a few people are being tested. And then over 39,000 deaths versus the United States over 159,000. So cases over 1,901,000 in India, in the United States over 4,877,000. Then let's look at Indonesia, which has over 273 million people. How many cases does Indonesia have? Over 115,000, of whom over 5,000 have died. Or then let's look at Pakistan, which has over 220 million people. So far, Pakistan, according to these figures, has had, let's see, over 280,000 cases and almost 6,000 deaths. Or then, Brazil, we already looked at. Nigeria, with over 206 million people, has so far had over 44,000 cases and almost 900 deaths. Actually, over half of Africa's deaths come from one country, South Africa, which has so far had over 516,000 cases and over 8,000 deaths. How many people does South Africa have? Over 59 million people. So unfortunately, Trump seems to like statistics when he can manipulate them. And he rarely tells the full truth in these interviews. And unless it's somehow advantageous for him. So this is one of the reasons why those who plan to vote for Trump again should then brace themselves should Trump win for another turbulent presidential term. May God bless and protect us all.